Kate holds a Juris Doctorate from American University's Washington College of Law, the only law school in the nation founded by and for women. She is the creator and host of the podcast Ordinary Equality, and we're so privileged to have her here tonight with us. Please help give a warm Kansas City welcome to Kate Kelly.
Hello, everyone. So excited to be here. Thank you for coming. Thank you for your patience. Just came in from DC this morning. My flight was supposed to be at 10 a.m. Due to 2 mechanical malfunctions. I had to change planes 3 times. I had to wait on the tarmac for 6 hours. And it was absolutely bonkers, but here I am. So I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to talk to you about constitutional equality. Like they said, I'm happy to answer questions. That's when I think things are most fun and most productive. So I'll speak a little bit about my book and about the Equal Rights Amendment, but I'm happy to take your questions. If you have something that's like burning in your heart, please, there is nothing more, nothing I like to talk about more than equality. And I wanted to start off really quick. Does anyone know why Women's Equality Day is August 26th? Yes, okay, so to recap for those watching at home, of course there's someone in the audience who knew. This is an incredible audience. And the reason that Women's Equality Day, and this ties into the Equal Rights Amendment and what we'll talk about later, the reason that Women's Equality Day is on August 26th is the 19th Amendment, the amendment giving women the constitutional right to vote, was ratified in Tennessee. And that was the last state to do it, and it was by 1 vote, and it was this nail biter, and they finally got the amendment. But in order to get an amendment recognized by the federal government, once it's, Article 5 of the Constitution says that there are 2 requirements. One is it passes by 2/3 in both houses, and one is that it's ratified by 38 or 3/4. Now it's 38 states. So that happened. It passed in Congress, and then Tennessee was this final state. But there's one more step. It's a statutory requirement, and at the time, it was the Secretary of State who had to sort of sign, seal, and deliver. They have to certify it, and then they have to publish it in the Federal Register. And that happened on August 26th. That is why Women's Equality Day is on August 26th. That's the final day when the 19th Amendment officially became part of the US Constitution. There's another interesting part of that story, which is that on August 26th, no one was present. They did not have a ceremony. They did not invite any of the women who had been fighting for decades and decades. They did it completely secretly behind closed doors. A man named Bainbridge Colby, boo. So a man named Bainbridge Colby decided that the women's movement had been too cantankerous and that there was too much infighting in the women's movement. And believe me, if you read my book, there was a lot of infighting. And if you read letters from suffragists at the time, it is like wild. So if you're in movements now and you're like, oh, there's a lot of drama, believe me, it is nothing compared to the suffragists. They're like writing letters to each other like, she's a duplicitous whore, she's like da-da-da-da, like I hate so-and-so. Like there's constant like factions and fighting. And so because of this, one man decided that he was going to put it into the Constitution without inviting anyone that had worked so hard for it. And so Women's Equality Day is also a marker of women's inequality and the ways that we have to keep fighting for ourselves to be heard, the ways that we have to keep fighting for our own dignity and to be part of our own liberation. I tell you also that story to say that we're also at that exact precipice with the Equal Rights Amendment. So you saw the video, and many of you are ERA experts in your own right, have worked hard on the ERA. I can see there's many of you who have probably worked on it for decades, probably since the first iteration. That point where we have met the requirements of Article 5 of the Constitution, but it has not been finalized or recognized by the federal government as part of the Constitution, that's the part we're at. We're like, in 19th Amendment speak, we're like, Tennessee has already ratified, we're there, we're just waiting for this one person to sign a piece of paper. Now, today, that person is actually the archivist of the US. So again, this is a statutory requirement. This is not a requirement in the Constitution. This is not part of Article 5. So this unelected librarian, we love librarians, we're here at a library, but this unelected librarian is now the person who is charged with finalizing an amendment and recognizing it as part of the Constitution. And actually today, that person is the first ever nominated female archivist. So today we have an archivist, her name is Colleen Shogan, and she's just been put in, and this is her, arguably one of her first tasks. And so we can talk more about the ins and outs and like where it stands and why she won't do it and all that kind of good stuff. But that's why we're celebrating women's equality on Saturday, and that's the position we find ourselves in today with the Equal Rights Amendment, the exact same position. Hopefully, honestly, I don't even care if she just does it in secret. I'm like, Colleen, listen, it's fine. If you have to do it in secret in your office without telling anyone, that's fine beyond me. However we can get it done, I'm here for it. But that's where we find ourselves today. I wanted to back up a little bit and talk more about the book. I'm an expert on the ERA, and I talk a lot about the ERA, and whenever I do book presentations, my partner is like, you have to talk about the book. So I want to talk about the book too, and help people understand kind of why I decided to write the book this way. So if you have any questions about the substance of the ERA, I'm happy to answer those. But I also want folks to feel free to ask me any questions about publishing or how I decided, what I decided for the book. So the reason the book is called Ordinary Equality, if you already have a copy, it's a quote from Alice Paul. Alice Paul was one of the co-authors of the Equal Rights Amendment. It's not exactly clear from history how many there were. I think there was a group of about 7 to 10 feminist attorneys at the time. Alice Paul got her law degree at Washington College of Law, where I went in DC, and then there were other attorneys as well. One of them I talk about in the book. Her name is Crystal Eastman. Crystal Eastman is one of the most important people in American history that no one knows about. She was the co-founder and actually the person who first conceived of the idea of the ACLU. So the ACLU was actually founded by a woman. This is very little known because Crystal Eastman was pregnant at the time. She went in the hospital and had some complications postpartum. So while she was in the hospital giving birth and recovering from giving birth, a man took over the organization that she had conceptualized, that she had founded, and when she got out of the hospital, his name was on the letterhead. And that, exactly, boo. Heads up, there'll be a lot of booing tonight. So that is why today, many people, even people who work at the ACLU, do not know that Crystal Eastman was the actual founder. So I just had a chance to go up to upstate New York, Seneca Falls. It was the exact 100-year anniversary of the unveiling of the ERA in Seneca Falls, New York, and on July 21st. So we're just on the just following the exact 100-year anniversary of the ERA. And as a part of that, we had a chance to go to Crystal Eastman's grave dedication. Her grave was unmarked and unknown for 95 years. It was only after the recent publication of her, of a biography about her, which is excellent and is cited in my book and everyone should read, that even her grandchildren and her great-grandchildren did not know where she was buried. And so they rediscovered the place where she had buried, and I had the opportunity to go to a dedication of her grave. And again, this is one of the most important people in American history. She was part of really a triumvirate of Alice Paul and Lucy Burns and her, who really got the 19th Amendment across the finish line, founded the National Women's Party, drafted the Equal Rights Amendment, founded the ACLU. Like, this is an incredibly talented, amazing person who has had a just phenomenally important, lasting impact, and no one knew where she was buried for almost 100 years. And I say that to say that what they started out with in the introduction is I wanted to tell the stories of people that are less known. I wanted to tell the stories of these incredibly important, very, very brilliant women and queer people who have been fighting this fight all along, who very rarely get spoken of. When I talk to people and go around and do talks about the book, even, feminist historians or other folks who are, very suffrage history nerds and other kinds of people are very surprised about some of the people. They say, I've never heard of these people. How have I never heard about these people? And the reason that you've never heard about these people, I'm sure you'll be shocked, is that our narratives have been suppressed. Our narratives of people who have been fighting, of people who have been really just savants, brilliant people, have really been buried. So I start the book out before the Constitution was written, before we had a country. And I start the book out with a woman named Molly Brandt. Molly Brandt was Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, up in what is now upstate New York and southern Canada. Canada, the word Canada actually comes from Kanata, which means village in Haudenosaunee. So there were already people existing on this land, of course, when we got here. But not only were they existing, they had incredibly sophisticated forms of government. The Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, were what they called people of the Longhouse. So they had a confederacy where there were individual clans who maintained their own autonomy, but they came together as one nation. That idea, this Confederate idea of multiple states coming together as one nation, is explicitly the idea that was copied in our founding of our country. So they knew about the Haudenosaunee. It was very common. Benjamin Franklin wrote about the Haudenosaunee in his newspaper. They covered it. It was, this was New York State. So that many people, including these early suffragists, were living alongside and next to and interacting frequently with Native people. But one thing that they didn't copy from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, so they copied the idea of this federalist system, but they didn't copy women's equality. So the Great Law of Peace in the Haudenosaunee had men and women as equals. So women participated in all levels of governance, women selected the chiefs, women negotiated land deals. So there's a quote I love in the book. It's from a Cherokee interaction where they went to a land deal, and when they got there, they looked around and they said, "Where are the women? We can't do a land deal without women. Those are the people who negotiate all of these different things." And they thought, what kind of backwards country doesn't have any women participating? And that was true. At the time, it was understood that if you were Haudenosaunee or a member of these other tribes and you gave up your citizenship to become an American citizen, you were losing rights. You were losing autonomy. That was understood at the time. And so I say that I start the book out that way to help people understand that this was not an accident. It wasn't just everyone at the time thought women weren't equal, and so they just did what everyone did. No, it was an intentional decision to leave people out of the Constitution from the very beginning. Even their own wives. The next chapter in the book is about Abigail Adams. She's a little bit better known. Abigail Adams, wife of President John Adams, and she is considered by many historians to be sort of a de facto framer of the US Constitution. The reason is during the Constitutional Convention, she was writing letters every day back and forth with her husband. He was asking her for advice. He was really consulting with her about what they were going to do and how they were going to make this new Constitution. Abigail Adams wrote in a famous letter to her husband many things. One of them is, "Remember the ladies," if you've heard of that. But in that letter, if you read the full letter, and it's very long, it's not just "remember the ladies." She says, "Remember the ladies." She also says, "We will not be beholden to a government that does not take us into account." She says, "We will foment a rebellion." She is very serious about advocating for women to be included in the Constitution. So the system of governance they modeled it after included women as equals. Their peers, wives, and other women at the time who they knew, who were close to them, were advocating for women to be put in the Constitution before it was written, at the same time. So this is not a new concept. This is not something where we're inventing wokeness. This debate, this discussion has existed since before the Constitution was written. And I think it's incredibly important to know that because the same forces that are keeping us out of the Constitution now are the same forces that existed in 1789. It's an intentional decision, and it can be unmade. It's not impossible. It's not impossible to conceive a gender equal society. It is not impossible to envision a document that includes all people. In fact, in 85% of countries, there is a gender provision in their constitutions. This includes countries where the US has been very active in the writing of their new constitutions, like Afghanistan and Iraq. When we consult other people in rewriting their constitutions, we consult them to put in a gender provision. But we do not have a gender provision ourselves. This is another reason why we haven't ratified CEDAW, which is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's the main and most basic women's rights treaty. We are one of 6 countries total in the world that has not ratified CEDAW. And so in many ways, we are a very, very bad outlier when it comes to gender equality, although it's purportedly something we export. Or that other nations should look to us. That couldn't be farther from the truth, specifically when it comes to our most basic document, our founding document. Okay, that was all depressing. I'm going to tell you something fun and interesting, and not depressing. So I want to go back to Crystal Eastman. So Crystal Eastman, like I said, was a suffragist, fought alongside the other suffragists to get the 19th Amendment ratified. They were sort of these like young upstart feminists and suffragists who, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all these other women were going too slow, and they considered them to be outdated, and they wanted like radical tactics. So Alice Paul and Crystal Eastman and Lucy Burns, they went to London and they learned from British suffragists how to put bombs in mailboxes, how to shatter windows, how to do, very, very confrontational tactics in order to call attention to their cause. So they're like, we're done writing letters, we're gonna do some action. So one of the first things they did was have a huge parade. It was one of the first times in 1913 they had a huge parade, a suffrage parade. They also decided to picket the White House. That's the first time that had been done, where the focus of their energy was at the White House. And they did silent sentinels. which means they stood outside the White House, with their banners and silent. But they were not like demure women waiting. They, in addition to silent sentinels, which you hear about a lot, they also had these huge bonfires in front of the White House. They would burn the president in effigy. They would burn his speeches. So they would print out these huge volumes of speeches and say, your words mean nothing abroad if we don't have equality at home. They would burn his speeches. They would picket. They would do extreme tactics. And then, of course, eventually they were arrested, and they did hunger strikes in jail where they were imprisoned. These extreme tactics, this escalation is finally what got the 19th Amendment over the finish line. And Crystal Eastman, in 1920, when they did ratify the 19th Amendment, and Bainbridge Colby signs it in secret, and finally the 19th Amendment is part of the Constitution, and women have the constitutional right to vote. Of course, that means there were many barriers that remain to this day from full enfranchisement. So not every woman got to vote, but they had the ostensible constitutional right to vote. Immediately after that, Crystal Eastman gave a speech. And the speech was titled, "Now at Last We Can Begin." They had been fighting for decades to get the constitutional right to vote. And as soon as that happened, they're like, we got to move on to the next thing. And in that speech, "Now at Last We Can Begin," Crystal Eastman talked about what she called the feminist platform. Again, this is in 1920. In 1920, the feminist platform involved many things that we still talk about today. They were equal pay for equal work. They were what she called voluntary motherhood. So in 1920, the public feminist project involved reproductive rights and freedom, explicitly voluntary motherhood. Again, these are not new fights that we are fighting. These fights are well over 100 years old. And Crystal Eastman also said, the ERA is worth it, even if it takes 10 years. So she underestimated the amount of time it would take, slightly. 100 years later, we're still here, fighting for this ever-important amendment. But the principle remains the same, that it's worth it no matter how long it takes. You have to remember that they had just gotten an amendment done. So they're like, all right, we got that one done. Like, how bad could this be? And then, of course, we know the rest of the story. The ERA first introduced in 1923, actually by Susan B. Anthony's nephew. So he was then a congressman from Kansas. He introduced the ERA in the House. And that was the start. The ERA was introduced every Congress from 1923 until 1972 when it passed. When it passed in Congress in 1972, there were only 8 senators who voted against it. Can you imagine today an amendment having to do with gender and only 8 senators even dare to oppose it? That's how popular the Equal Rights Amendment was. It passed by far more than the 2/3 necessary in both houses and immediately started being ratified. Hawaii ratified it on the same day. Because of the time difference, it was still like early afternoon in Hawaii by the time news got to them. So it passed in Congress and they ratified it in Hawaii on the same day. It passed by, and many of you in this room were part of this movement, it passed by 30 states within the first year. It was like a foregone conclusion. Many, many people thought it's just going to happen, it's inevitable. One of those people was not Alice Paul. When it passed in 1972, I tell this story in the book, one of the women, her name was Ellie Smeal. Ellie Smeal was very involved in the National Organization for Women, and they, it passed, and they were like, "Where's Alice? Where's Alice?" This woman who had been involved in 1923 in introducing the ERA was still alive and still fighting for it. And so right on Capitol Hill, if you ever go to DC, there's a museum called Belmont Paul. It's where the National Women's Party headquarters was, and it's where Alice Paul lived. So it's right in between the Senate office buildings. This is the last tangent, I promise you. But originally, originally the National Women's Party was seated in the exact location where the Supreme Court is today. And they forced them, by eminent domain, to move their National Women's Party headquarters against their will. So the Supreme Court is literally built paving over women's rights from the very beginning. And so they moved their headquarters from the site of the Supreme Court to what is now the National Women's Party. It's in between the Senate office buildings. So when it passed in 1972, they were like, "Where is Alice? Where is Alice? We got to find her." They ran, I heard this story from Ellie Smeal herself. They ran to the National Women's Party headquarters, and they found Alice in the back of the room at her desk, and she was weeping. She was not weeping because she was happy. She was weeping because she said, the deadline will kill it. She knew that they had, in order to make all these backroom deals and in order to get the amendment passed, and there were really only two senators who really worked hard against it and opposed it. One of them was Emanuel Seller, who was then beat by the youngest woman to ever win in Congress. When they found Alice, she said, the deadline will kill it. It was a 7-year deadline. And so she predicted so far into the future, she said, it's not going to happen in 1972. Unfortunately, this prophetic vision came true. And towards the end of the decade, an anti-ERA movement, which hadn't existed up to that point, picked up steam. And that's when states started trying to reverse their ratifications. At first, it was so wildly popular, no one dared to oppose it, no one did. Many states passed, and then towards the end of the decade, this anti-ERA movement sort of tried to reverse the tide. In 1978, 100,000 people marched in Washington in support of extending the deadline. So they extended the deadline from 1979, they voted in 1978 to 1982, so they could make it a full decade. It passed in 72, they said, okay, we'll have the deadline expire in 82. Why did they actually do that? Why didn't they just eliminate the deadline? The 19th Amendment had no deadline. It would have been in the Constitution no matter when they ratified it. With the ERA, the reason that they extended it 3 years is because they knew there was this huge pressure. 100,000 people are marching in Washington. Like, it's on the top of everyone's mind. Everyone knows about it. It's constantly in the news. Like, there is no way to avoid it. So they know they have to extend the deadline, but they also don't want it to pass. There are very few women in Congress at this point. And so what they did is they extended it 3 years. They knew that 3 years was not long enough to get rid of the state senators, most of whom had 6-year terms. So they knew 3 years was not long enough to get rid of the senators based on their ERA position. So they could extend it, placating people, but they knew they had the calculation. They did not have the votes in the states, and that came true. Your questions on your tongue. We're about to do questions. But I just want to finish by saying that for many, many decades after that 1982, I was 2 years old at the time. I don't remember this. There are many generations of women who didn't know about the ERA and weren't really part of the fight, because in 1982 it fell out of the national discourse. And many people, I think you saw it in the video, they declared it on TV, DOA. Phyllis Schlafly had a huge party, and they all celebrated the death of the ERA. Fast forward to 2017, one of the people in the clip, Pat Spearman. Pat Spearman is a state senator in Nevada, and Pat was contacted by some ERA advocates who had never given up. One of them was a woman named Helen DeBassier Swanson, who I write about in the beginning of my book. It's also how I found out about the ERA. Helen DeBassier Swanson was one woman who never gave up on the ERA. She did a cross-country tour, I think from Maine to California, walking in support of the ERA. And in part of that walk, she walked through Nevada. She contacted Pat Spearman. She and other advocates contacted Pat Spearman and asked Pat to carry an ERA bill. Pat's like, what? What is the ERA? Many people don't know. And so once they explained what the ERA was and why we still didn't have it, I think Pat was probably confused and thought, didn't that happen in the 1970s? Which is what most people think. When they explained to her that it hadn't happened and that states could still ratify, she got it through. She got it through their legislature on the heels of the Women's March in 2017. So, many, many people fought against her. They said, oh, this is purely symbolic. Why are you doing this? This is a waste of time. And she's like, well, if it's purely symbolic, let's just do it. Can't hurt. She also gave an incredible speech about symbolism. And she said, if this is purely symbolic, we need the symbol. We need the symbol in our Constitution that men and women and people of all genders are equal. Why not just do it? So they got it ratified in 2017 in Nevada. All of a sudden, people are like, wait, what? Is that a thing? Can we still do this? And in 2018, it was ratified in Illinois. In 2020, it was ratified by Virginia. So those were the 3 states left that we needed from the original fight. And so we had finally gotten to this 38. We'd met the threshold. And this is not an easy threshold. This is the hardest constitution in the world to change. It's very, very difficult to amend the US Constitution. Other countries rewrite their constitutions periodically. Chile just had a whole referendum on totally revamping their constitution. Our constitution is very hard to change. So we did it. It passed in 1972 by more than 2/3 necessary in both houses of Congress. And now, in 2020, we had the final state. So is the ERA part of the Constitution? I would argue yes. Because every time we meet the threshold, they move the goalpost. Every time we do something impossible, it's impossible. It's almost inconceivable to think that we would get 38 states to ratify a provision saying that everyone is equal and they cannot discriminate on the basis of sex. So every time we meet this threshold, they move it. They move the target, they move the goal. We have met the threshold. If you're an originalist, which I'm not, to be clear, but even if you're an originalist, the original framers of the Constitution put in Article 5. Article 5 says you can change the Constitution, and it has been changed 27 times. Does anyone know what the 27th Amendment is? Most lawyers don't know this either. The 27th Amendment has to do with congressional pay. It's called the Madison Amendment. It was first proposed by James Madison, and then 202 years later, it was ratified in the 1990s. So if 200 years isn't too long to ratify an amendment, why is 50 years? Why can't we have something that was passed in both houses of Congress in 1972 in 2023? So the original framers of the Constitution put in a way to change it, and we met that threshold. It is my argument that the ERA is part of the Constitution, and it was part of the Constitution on January 27, 2020, when it was ratified in Virginia. I am not alone. Many constitutional legal scholars believe this. Lawrence Tribe, who is professor emeritus at Harvard Law School and one of the most preeminent constitutional legal scholars of our time, if not of all time, has written a letter to Congress saying the same thing, that the ERA is the 28th Amendment currently and is enforceable. So that's where we're at, one signature away. And I think part of the reason I wanted to write the book in this way, featuring the stories of women and queer people all across the generations, is so that we see ourselves as part of this movement. We see ourselves as constitution makers. Women are not often portrayed as constitution makers, but we are, because we're currently changing the Constitution. That's the project. That's what we're involved in, is changing the Constitution, changing our most basic, fundamental legal document to include us. And I also wanted the story to be illustrated. So if you look through the book, it's heavily, heavily illustrated. There's diagrams, there's photographs, there are all kinds of jazzy graphics. I did not design it, but a very good friend of mine, also a Mormon lesbian, ex-Mormon lesbian, we made a good pair, designed the book. And the reason I wanted it to be illustrated is I wanted young people to see themselves as part of this movement. I wanted them to see photographs of people who had fought for the ERA and to understand that it wasn't just white women, it wasn't just straight women. Women of color, queer people, we have been here all along, and we have been fighting on the forefront of this movement, and we won't stop. It's worth it even if it takes 10 more years. Or 100 more years, but please let it not be 100. So yeah, I'm happy to take your questions. Does anyone have any questions? Hi.
Women's Equality Coalition. My question is, let me just give it a context. One of my organizations, the U.S. Women's Caucus at the UN, did some research trying to understand why do so many women on the right vote against their interests as women. What is that? What we found in doing some research is patriarchy and racism. Can you comment on that and whether you agree with that, and give us some advice of how do you confront that or combat that? Because that is a hard job to combat those two entrenched ideologies.
Yeah, such a good question. Thank you so much. So I think that's exactly accurate. And I think a better way to phrase it is they're not fighting against their own interests because racism benefits them. So if you're in a position where racism and patriarchy, as you identified, if you're in a position where your proximity to a man is more powerful, more beneficial, gives you more money, gives you more access, gives you more, I mean, like, honestly, they're kind of making an accurate calculation. Like, I hate to say it, but like in our current system, women aren't the ones who are like winning the most. And so it's very craven. It's not how I think. It's not how I was raised. It's not what I believe. But if you're just making a basic calculation of your own survival and your protection for your children and like, you know, benefits that you receive and all of these different things, I see a lot of women who attach themselves to men in order to, for many reasons. Some of them are privilege, some of them are money, some of them are all these different things. And so if you're attached to a man in that way, race privilege actually benefits you. And it probably benefits you in your mind more than feminism, because we're losing. Like, we're losing benefits, we're falling back. And so if you're just making like a craven calculation or even a subconscious calculation, it actually it's true. It does benefit you. Race privilege benefits you, like, you know, proximity to men benefits you. If you're connected to a man in that way and you want him to earn more, you want him to get unearned advantages, you want him, you'll bolster that. So I actually think it's more beneficial to stop thinking about it as they're voting against their own interests and understand that they're actually voting for their own interests. And unfortunately, that's true. And so we need to do like a much better like marketing campaign, I don't even know what to say, for feminism, and help people understand the concrete realities and the way that they will actually very concretely benefit. I think, and this, I won't do a whole rant about the Barbie movie, you're in luck, but I will say, I went to the movie, I enjoyed the movie, it's fun and funny, but when everything is feminism, nothing is feminism. And so when everyone's like, I'm a feminist, I went to the Barbie movie, but there's like no concrete ask, there's no demands, there's no idea that there has to be a next step to actually change things. Like when you can psychically identify yourself as a feminist, but you don't actually have to do any feminist action, the other side has completely succeeded in co-opting feminism because it means nothing. It means you put something pink on your social media and then you're a feminist. That's not what it meant in the 1970s. What it meant was you had to fight, you had to join a club, you had to propose a bill, you had to fight for the ERA, you had to show up in the streets. Those were the ways that you became a feminist. And now you just like kind of identify as one. So yeah, so two things. I think one is they are actually fighting for their own interest and we have to work to make that no longer true. And then the second is we have to make feminism mean something. We have to organize with people. We have to do the bare minimum. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to try to do this calmly. When you talked about this, I think it must have been, it was before COVID. I was in a conversation called Courageous Conversations, and we were dealing with women's equality and race. And I should say that I belong to a multiracial family, so this is, and one of the speakers pointed out the thing that white women got Trump elected. And I have thought about that, and picking up on what you just said, it is, the reason of that is just because of what you said about white women, basically. And I wish I had answered it, and I've said, this is what I wish I had said at that time, is that it's because that there are too many women, and in this instance, white women, who do not realize that the question of equality is not between white supremacy, it's about white male supremacy. And once you realize as a woman, which I did quite young in my life, that it's white male supremacy, and in doing research that a very long time ago, millennia ago, someone, I'm not quite sure who, decided that you determined a child's progeny through the male. That is the stupidest thing anybody ever decided to do. It is totally contrary to reality. That is not the way it works. And the Jews have known that you're not a Jew unless your mother's a Jew, because how can you tell otherwise? Come on. So, basically, when you're talking about equality, the basic division in equality in human beings is between male and female. If male and female are equal, all the races men and women are equal and that sort of thing. So, yeah, it's just very frustrating to me is that I think that if women would realize that it's what's going on, and you can see it in all the dimensions of what's going on in society, is that it's white male supremacy is the battle that's being fought in our country right now.
Yeah, and I think, thank you.
Yeah.
And I think, so it's very important to keep in mind that perpetuating racism is a choice, and that many women along the way have made that choice because they thought it was to their advantage. So I'll use Alice Paul as an example. Alice, I think it's very important to tell complex stories about people. If you understand anything about history, you know that a lot of very important people were also very terrible people or made bad decisions. I think it's important to understand that everyone is human and that we can't venerate anyone as perfect. So I preface that to say Alice Paul was very, very racist. Alice Paul in 1913, in that parade I talked about, ordered Black women specifically to march in segregated sections. They did not listen. So Ida B. Wells and others were like, no, we're not doing that. And they marched with their profession or with their college or with their state instead. But that was a decision. That was a choice. Many suffragists fought against her. Other white suffragists were saying no, this is insane. We're all working together for suffrage. You can't segregate the parade. And she did. That was not an isolated incident. So when another woman that I write about in the book, her name is Mary Church Terrell. Mary Church Terrell was a Black suffragist, incredible, fascinating woman, spoke many languages, was a teacher, was a philanthropist, was a suffragist. And when, in 1920, when they ratified the 19th Amendment, Black suffragists, including Mary Church Terrell, went to the National Woman Party headquarters and said, okay, great, we got ostensibly the right to vote, but you know that Black women, particularly in the South, are not going to be able to vote. And so how do we actually keep working, moving forward for women's suffrage, universal suffrage? And they said no. They were like, we're done with the 19th Amendment. We're moving on to the next thing. And we don't care. We don't care that there isn't universal suffrage. And so that was another point where they made a decision to leave certain people behind. And the last example I'll give, there were, when they were fighting, I talk about it in the book, but when they were fighting to include sex in Title VII, they reached out to an incredibly racist Virginia Republican to essentially add sex to Title VII as a joke to tank it. And Alice Paul was willing to work with very racist politicians because she thought it was strategic. And I think we're just going to have to keep learning the lesson again and again and again until we learn that it is never strategic to leave people behind, that it will never benefit us. It will never benefit us to leave people behind. It will never benefit us to side with racism. It's not strategic. It's a decision that they made over and over again. It was not inevitable, but we can make different decisions. And so I think that's important, why we tell nuanced stories of history, so that we understand it was not inevitable. It wasn't inevitable that they didn't include women in the Constitution. It wasn't inevitable that they ordered the suffrage parade to be segregated. It wasn't inevitable that they threw certain people under the bus, and we can make different decisions.
I have a question about kind of the Title VII, maybe answer some of it, but the idea that it's just symbolism, right? If it's just symbolism, put them in. But what would you say to the substantive protections that a constitutional amendment would give that we don't currently have?
Yeah, so first I would say, if you really think it's just substantive, why not? Like, if their argument is like it's just substantive, then like let's do it. Symbols are powerful. The American flag is powerful. A ring on your finger indicating you're married is powerful. Like, symbols are powerful. Let's just do it. Even if, let's say, it was purely symbolic. But of course, they wouldn't be fighting it if it was purely symbolic. The two main arguments against the Equal Rights Amendment on substantive grounds today, in the 1970s, it was like women are going to be drafted and dragged onto the front lines, women are going to lose privileges, women are like, it was all these scare tactics. And this huge kind of cloud of scare tactics that were never really real has all distilled down to two things today. One is reproductive rights and freedom, and one is trans rights and LGBTQ rights. So when I hear people who oppose the Equal Rights Amendment, it's like abortion, 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 trans rights. Abortion, 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 abortion. Like, those are the things they focus on. And whenever, it's kind of a funny position that I find myself in, because when I'm arguing about the ERA, I'm just like, yeah, I don't have any arguments. Like, I agree with you. I agree that it will protect abortion access, and I agree with you that it will protect trans people and LGBTQ people. And that's why I want it. Like, I don't disagree with the opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment about what it will do. What I disagree is whether or not that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. So very quickly, I will say it's extremely substantive in two ways. One, it will improve outcomes in court. So right now, we do not have an equality provision in the Constitution, and we've seen that most recently in the Dobbs decision, but many decisions to come where they completely gut the right to privacy. They're not wrong. When we pick up a copy of the Constitution and they're like, like looking in here, don't see equality, they're right. It's not in there. And yes, I believe in substantive due process rights. Yes, I believe that the 14th Amendment should protect us, but it doesn't anymore, and we need to wake up to that. And so it will change the Constitution. Whoever is sitting on the Supreme Court, when they're like thumbing through, trying to see what's in there, equality of rights shall not be abridged or denied by the United States or any state on account of sex will be in there. And they cannot deny that. And the words will be in the Constitution. It's not in the penumbra, it's not a shadow, it's not extrapolation, it will be in there. And so that will very, very significantly change outcomes in the courts for people who experience discrimination on the basis of sex.
Kate, one of our questions. Go ahead. I'm sorry, are you done?
Oh, the second part.
Go ahead. Yeah. We have a question from the chat when you're done.
Really, really quickly. The second part is, so it'll change substantive outcomes in the courts, but the second part is we'll give Congress a hook to pass laws that protect women and girls and people who experience gender discrimination. And that doesn't exist. Congress is very limited right now to what they can pass. There are many laws that they try to pass and they're ruled unconstitutional. And so we will be protected in the courts. We will be able to use the federal legislature to pass additional protections for women that cannot exist and do not exist now. So when people say it's purely symbolic, they are wrong. They know they're wrong, and they're afraid.
Thank you. One of the questions from the chat is how you ended your talk and that we're just waiting on an archivist to sign. I mean, so what does that really mean, though? What are we really just waiting on that, or what actually has to happen, and what can we do about it?
Yeah, so there are a few things that people can do. That's literally it. That's like literally the only step left. And that's, again, a statutory requirement, which means it's not in the Constitution. But there has to be some way that the government is like, okay, we concede, it's in the Constitution. Like, when you go to the National Archives, there has to be like a display about the 28th Amendment. When they pass out like pocket constitutions to kids, like it has to have the 28th Amendment in there. Otherwise, it's not real and it's not enforceable. So the archivist that has to happen. Like that we cannot skip that. That has to happen. But the current archivist, and this is like we're getting into the weeds, but I like it. So I'll try to explain as smoothly as possible. But the current archivist, during the Trump administration, the previous archivist, who was a man, David Ferriero, he's like oh no, like Nevada ratified and Illinois ratified, and he listed those like in the official list. That's what they do. The archivist like keeps the list, and those two were listed. And then it came down to Virginia, and he's like, ugh, like this is getting awkward. I don't know what to do. And so he wrote to the Office of Legal Counsel, which is essentially the lawyers for the president or the administration. The archivist is, the president is the boss of the archivist. It's part of the executive branch. And so, surprise, surprise, the Trump OLC said that the ERA is dead, that the deadline is passed, and don't do it. So the archivist didn't. Then 3 states sued the archivist, Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia, to try to compel him to proceed. That is working its way up in the courts. The DC Circuit just decided, and it hasn't made it to the Supreme Court yet. I'm not sure that they will appeal. And like it was actually decided more on standing, so the procedural issues were not resolved. That's a long story to say. Then the Biden administration issued a clarifying statement from their OLC saying that Congress could still proceed and there was nothing stopping them. And a memo from OLC is not like legal precedent. It's sort of like a loose opinion that they kind of abide by, but there's many examples of those changing. One example is the torture memos issued by the OLC in the Bush era, and then of course they were like, no, we don't torture. So they rescinded those previous memos. That happens a lot. That's a long way to say it's very an active question. What has to happen? It's my position and the position of many others that nothing needs to happen. Congress doesn't need to act, that the archivist just needs to proceed to certify and publish. That's one option. The other option that the president has been pushing is for Congress to act. So there are 2 bills. One is by Ayanna Pressley. That bill is to eliminate the original deadline. And that has bipartisan support. They voted on it this year. This is not like random. Like they literally voted on it in the Senate this year. It got 53 votes. Of course, 53 is not 60. And so that's a live issue in Congress. And then there's a second bill with Representative Cori Bush from the great state of Missouri to finalize the Equal Rights Amendment and instructs the archivist to proceed to certify. So those are 2 different bills going in tandem. So if you want to reach out to your representatives to tell them to support those bills, and there's also a congressional caucus for the ERA. Ayanna Pressley and Cori Bush founded the first ever congressional caucus for the ERA this March. So it's the first congressional caucus ever to exist solely in support of the Equal Rights Amendment. It's already the 5th largest caucus in Congress, has a lot of support. So invite your representatives to also join the congressional caucus for the ERA. If they're Republicans, even better. And there are no Republican members yet. But there's a lot of momentum building behind these bills and behind the further action. So it's pending in the courts, it's pending before the executive branch, it's pending in Congress, but very, very actively. Like I said, it was voted on the Senate this year. There are I think at least 2 Republican supporters of the Senate Joint Resolution 4 to eliminate the deadline. So Collins and Murkowski both voted for it and are co-sponsors. So it does even today have bipartisan support. And so I don't have a crystal ball. People are always like, when is it gonna happen? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't want to be Crystal Eastman. I don't want to say like the wrong thing and then curse it for 100 years. So I'm not sure what exactly will happen to push it across the finish line, but that is the only remaining technical requirement.
Thank you. Any other final questions?
You can tell I could talk about this all day.
You have a question, ma'am? Okay. Last question.
Yes, my question is 2-part. Do you think feminism is regressing or making progress today against the white nationalist movement? And second of all, I don't know if you've read the book Hood Feminism by Mickey Kendall. I'm just starting it. She has the position that feminists are leaving out a lot of poor women and women of color. So I wondered if you could address that. Thank you.
And the last thing I'm also going to say about how to get involved is get involved locally. We have Erica Benson from Project 28, Mo, and others who are working in Missouri on ERA ratification. Your state has never ratified the ERA, that's something you can work on. There's also state-level ERAs. 27 states have state-level ERAs, and they're doing very powerful work. Nevada just ratified a state-level ERA this past November to protect people on the basis of sex and so much more. So there's a lot you can do on the ERA. Other states are also passing resolutions in support of the 28th Amendment. So there's lots you can do on the state level, and I really encourage you to get involved. You can like some cities. I live in DC, and I'm trying to get a city council resolution supporting the ERA as the 28th Amendment. You can do it at the municipal level. So there's like tons of ways to get involved. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that. To your question, I think I don't think we have a feminist movement. Period. I don't see one. I think feminism is a brand, and for the most part, a nationwide organized movement that can make demands does not exist. There's not a group that can demand a meeting with the President of the United States and get one. There's not a group that organizes people in every state. Like, it just doesn't exist. I wish it did, but it doesn't exist. So then that could be like a whole nother very long conversation. I'm happy to stay after and chat with people. But I don't think we have a feminist movement, and I certainly not one that's, there are different issues. Like, people work on domestic violence or, there's a million different issues. Reproductive rights. Like, there's a reproductive rights movement, which is obviously doing terribly and failing on almost every level, not at the state level, but federally. So I think there are like pockets of issues that people work on, but like a unified feminist movement working on issues and organizing people in every state, I don't think that existed, and it hasn't existed for a long time. I'm part of the lost generation that was like never really part of that, and I think we're long overdue. There's like the Women's March, which is very important, but also it's not powerful. Like it galvanized us all, and a lot came out of it, and it was really, really important. But as far as like continued sustained leadership of people who can make demands, I just don't think that exists. Part of the reason I think that there isn't a cohesive feminist movement today is because of racism and because we haven't reconciled our past. We can't move on with each successive generation like making the same mistakes again and again and again. And being so incredibly divisive and leaving people out. So I think there needs to be a reconciliation. I think there needs to be a more, there's a lot of folks call themselves intersectional feminists. Intersectional feminism was a term coined by a woman named Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a professor of law at both UCLA and Columbia, incredible, phenomenal thinker. And actually most people don't know this, but intersectionality, the term was coined in a law review article. So in a law review article about tenants' rights, she wrote that some people experience overlapping forms of discrimination, and she called that intersectionality. And that concept has been used broadly to say that there are many forms of discrimination, and people experience them in different ways, and they impact different people differently. I think that's a very useful framework that we need to use going forward. But all that to say is, yes, I think, and there's like a whole nother conversation that we can have also about white feminism. White feminism is not white feminists or feminists who happen to be white. White feminism centers white people and centers the things that are most important to white women and sort of discounts everything else. That's also why there's a reproductive justice movement. The reproductive justice movement expands just beyond abortion access to the ability for people to have children when they want them and to raise them in safe environments. That's not just abortion access, that's a lot more, and that matters to a lot more communities. So I say that to say we need to really pull back. We need to understand what's important to many different communities. And until we do that work, I don't think we will have a feminist movement again. I think it's very possible. I know this sounds like very dire. I'm like, we don't have a feminist movement. But I say that to say we can have one again. And I think it's vitally important that we do, but it's incredibly difficult work to make those connections. It's incredibly difficult work to be very intentional about working together, about reaching across all kinds of different intersections of our lives. And we can do it. We just have to be very intentional about it, and we have to understand that, and I'll turn back to the book, that the people who are on the front pages aren't always the people who are doing the most important work. The people who are getting attention, the people who are remembered by history. There's a Mormon feminist named Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, and she said the famous quote that well-behaved women seldom make history. But actually, I've met her in person several times and read her book, and that's actually a sentence from a book about funerary texts in New England. And so it means the opposite of what the sentence seems to, like when they put it on a bumper sticker, they mean like women should rebel. But she actually meant everyday women just living normal lives should be remembered in history. That well-behaved women seldom make the pages of history. And so I think that's one of the most important things, is to understand and reach out to the people doing the most important work, even if they're not getting the most attention, and support them, support young people. I work almost exclusively with teenagers when I do my organizing activism. I work with a group called Generation Ratify. It's a youth-led movement to support the ERA. It was founded by two 15-year-old girls, and they're now 19. But there are no adult leaders in their group. It is solely youth, and they have chapters, I think, in 34 states. So they're very good at organizing, but they're young, and so they need money, they need support, they need people to volunteer, to do everything we can to support the next generation. So it's a very long answer to your question, but the answer is we need to do better, and we can do better.
Hey, thank you so much. You did a really good job of ending on a high note, when maybe we shouldn't be ending on a high note because there's so much more work to be done. But thank you, really inspiring and wonderful work from you. And everyone, the book is available and Kate is signing out front, and I hope that you'll buy the book. Thank you everyone so much for being here, and thank you again, Kate.